Hello, everyone. Here we are again for our fourth class of this European project called Visual Thinking for Education. As you remember, this module is called Philosophy in Everyday Life and the importance of its use in the art, observing, asking questions, interacting, and discovery. Today, we are going to cover the fourth section, which is about interacting. And we're going to delve deep into another philosopher and another philosophical tradition, namely John Dewey and pragmatism. We're also going to talk about very briefly Nietzsche and Hannah Arendt. They do not belong to pragmatism, but they are helpful in defining the theme of interacting. That is the theme of knowledge as a form of doing. But let's cut the chatter and let's go straight to this new topic. For centuries, philosophy has contributed to identify and define thinking as a form of pure contemplation, primarily at least. In classical philosophy, especially Plato, you might remember, thought is conceived as this movement of the soul that turns away from the changing world of appearances and move toward the eternal and immutable realms of forms or ideas. To think then, for Plato at least, is to see, to contemplate what is already there instead of intervening and changing what is becoming, what might become. This contemplative model or idea of thinking has deeply shaped our Western ideal, our Western canon, privileging detachment, theoretical vision, and truth, timeless truth, instead of a practical engagement with the world, over a practical engagement with the world. This conception, however, has persisted in many later traditions, and here let me make some examples. First of all, Aristotle. You might remember from last class that Aristotle was a little bit more attentive than Plato to the practical dimensions of human life. However, he still located the highest form of human activity in theoria, which is a Greek term that means this contemplative activity, this activity of contemplation that is completely disinterested, that is devoid of any practical utility. And so basically theoria is the contemplation, the disinterested contemplation of truth for its own sake. Medieval philosophy inherited this tradition, this contemplative tradition, and actually it intensified the hierarchy that Aristotle proposed. And so in this case, medieval philosophers treated intellectual life as this activity for the vision of divine truths. Of course, this vision was beyond and above the world of activity. Even in modern philosophy, echoes of this contemplative model remained very strong. And here we can make the two examples of Descartes on the one hand and Kant on the other hand. Descartes, on the one hand, indeed, conceived the essence of thought as a cogitatio, that is, as a purely internal activity of the mind, which was seeking to find certainties, to find truths that were absolutely certain. So this purely internal activity of the mind pursued certainty as its essential goal. That's the point. And of course, this goal was to be achieved before any action in the world. Kant, on the other hand, he actually recognized the importance of practical reason. However, he still drew a very sharp boundary between the theoretical activity and the practical activity and practical reason, as we said. So we can see here that although he recognized the importance of becoming aware of the practical side of our human mind, he still privileged, in a certain sense, the theoretical activity and still created a division between the two faculties and the two possibilities of our mind. All of these frameworks shaped intrinsically our modern conception of education, which, as a consequence, reduced learning to a memorization and an accumulation of static information. According to this model that we inherited from this kind of tradition, thought is not at all a form of creation or of transformation. Thought is just a process of storage and accumulation and reproduction. So basically, thinking equals memorizing certain information and reproducing them when it's needed. At the same time, the thinker is not considered as an active person, is not considered as someone that participates in the activity of thinking, in the activity of creating new thoughts, but the thinker is simply a spectator who passively receives the information and transmits them when it's necessary. And so you see here that the thinker does not do any kind of experimentation, questioning, or any sort of like it does not have the possibility of generating new ideas, new thoughts. Now, John Dewey, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Hannah Arendt, to cite the most important ones, were philosophers who tried to disrupt this traditional or classical image of thinking, insisting that genuine thinking is not about looking backwards to eternal truths or eternal ideas, but it's about engaging forward with the possibilities of life. Thus, knowledge or thought is not to be conceived as a mirror that simply reflects the reality that it's outside of us, but thinking is a form of doing. It's a form of intervention within reality, and this kind of intervention changes both the thinker and the object that is being thought, that is the environment. Now, for Dewey in particular, this shift from this contemplative model of thinking to a more active and engaging model of thinking is fundamental. And as he says in Democracy and Education, and I quote, "Thinking is the method of intelligent experience in its progressive expansion." This means, at least for Dewey, that thought emerges every time we encounter a difficulty, an obstacle, a problem. So thinking is triggered by real experience, and the act of thinking is directed toward the resolution of a certain problem. And you see here that thinking is born within action and at the same time ends in action. Knowledge, thus, it's not a product that we can possess, but it's actually a process, a way of experimenting, testing, and remaking, changing reality itself. Now, this perspective has many great advantages. One of these advantages is certainly that it allows to bridge the gap between theory and practice, or theory and action, because it shows us how ideas are not eternal essences that are detached from our everyday life, but they're actually tools in our hands that we can use to navigate life and solve problems that we face on a daily basis. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, that's the second philosopher that we cited. Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote decades earlier than Dewey, paved the way for such an active and transformative understanding of the act of thinking. In particular, Nietzsche rejected the idea of philosophers as neutral spectators of eternal truths, and instead he conceived of philosophy as this intervention in life itself. In The Gay Science, which is probably one of his most famous works, Nietzsche says, very provocatively, I must say, and here I read, "Philosophers are commanders and legislators. They say, thus it shall be." For Nietzsche, as we can deduce from this very short quotation, to think is never to remain neutral, is never to detach oneself from life, but actually to think is to take a stand, to create new horizons, to legislate about values. In one word, to think is to give a new form for life itself. Now, the emphasis on creativity and the ability to shape the world is really fundamental for Nietzsche's philosophy. And in his famous call for the re-evaluation of all values, as Nietzsche calls them, thought is presented as the tool that allows us to challenge and at the same time dismantle all those kind of inherited values, moral codes, and even habits that Nietzsche defines as life-denying. Indeed, concepts such as truth, morality, and even reason, Nietzsche says, are not timeless essences, but they actually have a history. They have been produced in history, and since they have a history, they are historically produced. They're open to be reinterpreted, to be challenged, to be transformed, to be negated, and they're open to be dismantled in order to create new truths, new values, new concepts. That's the key of Nietzsche's understanding of philosophy. And philosophy should do this, should reevaluate values and should create new values more appropriate to the historical period that we are living. That is what I wanted to say about Nietzsche. To conclude, just in summary, to think is to act upon reality at its deepest level, thus reshaping the frameworks through which human beings understand reality, but also understand themselves. Last but not least, Hannah Arendt equally broke with this classical image of the act of thinking in her later work, which is called The Life of the Mind, in one of her later works, because she wrote this book toward the end of her life. She described thinking not as a quest for timeless ideas, truths, or not as a quest for certainty, but as an activity of self-reflection and internal dialogue. And that's really important because you can already see here that she took inspiration from Socrates' philosophy, and thus she defined thinking as this silent conversation with oneself, as a practice of questioning what we know, as a practice of examining what we think is right, and thus as a practice of holding ourselves accountable for the decisions that we make. Now, this ongoing dialogue, this ongoing internal dialogue that we should continuously have with ourselves has the purpose not of creating an abstract kind of knowledge, not to create a sort of like space where we can put all of the informations that we have gathered throughout our life, but actually the aim of this internal ongoing dialogue with ourselves is to cultivate a disposition that safeguards both the moral and political life. So you see here that truly thinking as a political and ethical dimension that needs to be respected and needs to be accounted for. And that's the key for Hannah Arendt's conception of thinking. Now, her understanding of thinking was profoundly influenced by the Holocaust and by the trial against Adolf Eichmann in the 60s, during the late 60s. In her famous report, she coined this very famous formula, the banality of evil. And she used this formula to describe Eichmann's ordinariness. What struck Hannah Arendt was that Adolf Eichmann, was not a demonic figure as most of the people assumed and expected, but actually he was the most ordinary man, because he was a man that was not at all examining his actions. So what struck Hannah Arendt was the thoughtlessness that belonged to Eichmann. And this thoughtlessness, for Hannah Arendt at least, identified is not just his inability, but his refusal, which is the conscious refusal or unconscious refusal to enter into a dialogue with himself and to ask him basic questions to check, basic questions that would allow himself to check what he was doing. So for Hannah Arendt, the absence of thinking is what enables evil to occur, because it removes all of the inner checks that prevent us from blindly follow the rules coming from a superior authority. That's the key point. And in this sense, Hannah Arendt tells us and teaches us that to think is not a luxury, and it's not even the pursuit of an abstract knowledge or abstract truths. It's actually a practical necessity. It's a necessity for human beings who want to live in a shared world. So it's something that we need to learn how to do, and we need to do it all the time if we want to live in a shared world where we respect each other. Indeed, it's only by questioning ourselves, by having this inner dialogue with ourselves, that we can prepare the ground for judgment, that is, prepare the ground to evaluate a certain situation, decide whether these situations are wrong or right, and then assume the responsibilities for the decisions and the actions that we make. So genuine thinking, in conclusion, for Hannah Arendt, is what sustains freedom and political responsibility. It is what makes freedom and political responsibility possible. Okay, together, John Dewey, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Hannah Arendt illuminate a radical vision, because they illuminate the idea that thinking is not a passive registration of what already is, but it's the acting intervention and participation in what might become. That is, to think becomes a form of doing, and to do is always to enter into a dialogue with the world and to try at least to change the world. Thus, all of these philosophers teach us something essential. To think is a form of doing, is a praxis, a way of living, acting, and engaging with life and the world. And in this engagement, being both transformed and transforming the world. Now that we have this sort of like panoramic view of different accounts that challenged the traditional idea of what thinking is, we can move on to the analysis of John Dewey's understanding of what thinking is and how thinking is a form of doing. I'm going to focus on John Dewey because he actually has the most articulated and complex account of what thinking is and what it does. And so that's why I decided to look at John Dewey's philosophy. So let's start with a brief introduction of who John Dewey was. So John Dewey stands as one of the most influential American philosophers of all time. He was a leading figure of pragmatism, along with other philosophers. You might know William James or Charles Sanders Peirce, but he was one of the leading figures of this tradition of philosophy, and he tried to develop a philosophy that bridged the gap between reflection and everyday life, between reflection and experience, reflection and education, reflection and democracy, and also science. So you see here that the point was to connect philosophy with everyday life, with experience, with education, with democracy, and science. Now, in his work, he, of course, addressed academic debates, but he actually did something more, because he also reported the challenges of living in an increasing, modernizing, democratizing, and industrializing world or society. Dewey's central idea revolved around experience, democracy, inquiry, and growth. All of these ideas are, for him at least, essential to both personal development and collective progress. What I want to briefly point out before moving on to the central ideas of Dewey's philosophy is that he was never merely a philosopher in the narrow sense, that is, in the academic sense. In other words, he was not merely a person who taught philosophy in the universities. He was actually a public intellectual and an active reformer whose work reached far beyond the limits, the boundaries of the university. Indeed, through his books, through his essays, he was able to shape the debates about how philosophy should connect with everyday life, how democratic life should be sustained, and how schools should function, should actually be funded, and how they should function. For this reason, Dewey's figure is best understood as the figure of a thinker who was deeply embedded in life. Okay, now that we have this general understanding, let's move on to the most central or the core concepts of his philosophy, because these are going to be instrumental to understand how Dewey sees thinking and how he interprets thinking as a form of Dewey. In general, I want to say that for him, philosophy is not, of course, a detached speculation, as we might expect after the introduction, but it's a method of both criticism and reconstruction. Philosophy is a tool for improving the fundamental practices of education, politics, and culture. Now, the first concept that I want to talk about is actually the general definition of Dewey's philosophy, because Dewey's philosophy is defined as instrumentalism, which is a branch of pragmatism. Why is it called so? Let's look. Okay, so pragmatism in general rejects the idea that truth is the result of a correspondence between the reality outside of us and our thoughts, which expresses the reality through propositions. Instead, pragmatism emphasizes the practical consequences and implications of human beliefs and human theories. In particular, according to Dewey, and that's why we call Dewey's philosophy instrumentalism, concepts, theories, and also scientific laws, they're not a mirror of reality, but they're instruments, they're tools that we can use to navigate life. And navigating life means to solve problems and to engage differently with reality. So, for instance, just as a hammer and a map, they help us to achieve a certain goal, such as the goal of hanging a painting on the wall or meeting a friend at a location that we don't know exactly where it is, so too ideas help us to achieve a certain goal, which in this case is the goal of coping with situations of doubt, difficulties, or uncertainty. That is a situation that present a problem to us. The value of ideas, therefore, lies in their effectiveness in guiding our own actions and our inquiry about the world, not in describing the world. So that's the first fundamental point. From this point, I want to stress, Dewey is able to is able to overcome some of the rigid oppositions that have structured classical philosophy. So, for instance, theories and practice are not separated anymore because theories arise in and return to practical activity. On the other hand, the mind is not cut off from the body because the thinker is a kind of embodied problem solving. So when we think, we are embodying a problem and we are embodying the solution of that problem itself. Individuals are not in opposition with society because all the habits and ideas that they develop, they can develop them through shared communication and cooperation. And last but not least, humans are not detached from their environment because they always interact with it, transforming it and being transformed by it. That's the first point with this sort of like consequence that we can draw. The second point consists in the notion of experience. That is, the second point concerns the centrality of the notion of experience in Dewey's philosophy. Now, Dewey gave the term experience a richer and more active meaning than the empiricist tradition gave to this term. Now, for empiricist philosophers such as John Locke and David Hume, experience was to be understood as a raw sensory data. That is, our mind is blank, it's devoid of any information, and through experience, due to experience, thanks to experience, we can fill our mind with impressions and ideas, that is, with information. So basically, we receive impressions and ideas through experience from the external world. Dewey, of course, it rejects this picture of experience because it depicts human beings as being the passive spectators of the outside world. For him, experience is an ongoing and interactive process between the organism and the environment. So, to experience something is not simply to register a set of informations or sensations or impression about the thing, but actually to experience something is to engage with a situation that is composed of different elements. It's to test a situation, to respond to a situation, and to adapt to that kind of situation. Let me make a very brief example here. So, for instance, when a child touches a hot stove, they do not simply register the sensation of heat, but they actually learn something from this experience, something that allows them to modify their behavior and to develop a new habit. So a child who touches a hot stove does not simply register the sensation, oh, there's heat. They actually learn that they should avoid sources of heat because they are dangerous. And so in the future, they're not going to go near sources of heat or try to touch sources of heat because they are dangerous, and that constitutes a new habit. This is the general understanding of what experience is according to Dewey. So something that is depends on an interaction, an engagement with the environment, an ongoing active interaction. Dewey also says that the experiences that we make, so in general, the notion of experience is both transactional and developmental. This means that experience is transactional because it is also the result of a transition between the environment and the organism. The individual and the organism, and the individual and the environment, constantly act upon each other, and both of them are changed within this process. At the same time, experience is developmental because every new experience constitutes or can become the basis for growth, for a deeper understanding, and for further action. So it's the basis for our own growth and development. Now, here again, I want to draw a consequence that I think is really important because the concept of experience lies at the heart of Dewey's philosophy in general, but also at the heart of Dewey's philosophy of education in particular. Education, indeed, is not for Dewey something passive, is not the passive transmission of information from the teacher to the students, as if knowledge was a sort of like mirroring of an objective reality. On the contrary, I just got lost for a second. Education is the cultivation of habits of inquiry within meaningful and lived experiences. So a classroom, which is the space where we learn, where students learn, should not be thought and conceived as authoritarian factories in which students needs to memorize passively a set of information. On the contrary, classrooms should be thought as laboratory for democracies, where students learn by doing. That is, they learn by conducting experiments, by engaging in projects, by solving problems together and reflecting on the consequences of their actions. It is only in these kind of spaces, in such environments, that thinking and learning become continuous with life. itself. Okay, now that we have explained this first 2 points, we can move to the third point, which is about growth and democracy. For Dewey, indeed, the ultimate ethical and political value is that of growth. Now, this might sound a little bit problematic, at least, but Dewey understands growth, the concept of growth, not as a fixed end state, but as the capacity for continuous learning, self-renewal, and adaptation. So for him, a good society is a society where the opportunities for growth are maximized, where individual can grow, can learn, can adapt themselves, can self-renew, and they can do so constantly because the society offers them continuous possibility to grow. You can see here that the concept of growth is linked with that of democracy, and the concept of growth is fundamental, at least for Dewey, for a new kind of defense of democracy. Indeed, democracy for Dewey is a way of life grounded in communication, participation, and shared inquiry. And so it is only within a democratic society that individuals can learn from one another, can deliberate about common problems, and can shape the future together in new and creative, unique ways. So it is only in a democratic society that there are possibilities for growth. In this sense, democracy is the political embodiment of Dewey's philosophy of experience. Okay, so we have summarized 3 of the most important points that lie at the core of Dewey's philosophy. Yet, there is another point that we must stress and that we must cover because it constitutes one of the most original and influential contributions of Dewey's philosophy, and that is Dewey's understanding of knowledge and his interpretation of the act of thinking, of the process of thinking. Now, as we know, we might remember from the introduction, Dewey's is against traditional epistemologies that conceive of knowledge as a representation of an objective reality. And Dewey actually developed a pragmatic, experimental, and thoroughly naturalistic account of thinking and knowledge. For him, knowledge, therefore, is not a stockpile of static information or static representations of the world outside, but actually knowledge is a process of inquiry. It is an instrument that human beings have in order to cope with difficulties, with uncertain situations, and by coping with this situation, being able to reconstruct their experiences and therefore to grow. Thinking is, in this sense, is not a detached contemplation, but it's an active engagement with problems, a way of testing, of questioning, and reshaping our experience. Now, this critique that Dewey does is called the spectator theory of knowledge. That is, Dewey criticized the traditional image of thinking, and he called this traditional image of thinking the spectator theory of knowledge. Now, he thought that this picture, this theory of knowledge, was deeply misleading, and therefore he came up with his new vision, new understanding of what knowledge and thinking is. As I told you, the first problem with this spectator theory of knowledge that Dewey criticizes is that it gives us a misleading picture of what knowledge is, because it represents knowledge as this detached activity that does not have any practicality involved in it. It does not have a practical dimension, basically. But there is another problem that Dewey underlines, and that's the fact that this spectator theory of knowledge assumes that certainty and permanence are the main goal of thought, as if thinking is a process that only wants to achieve eternal truths, eternal essences, and eternal ideas that will never change. That will never be subject to change. And thus, this theory of knowledge leaves no room for growth, revision, and experimentation. And that's a problem for Dewey, because actually what we needed to do in our life is to experiment with the different situations in which we find ourselves, and thus to grow, not to constantly learn from our experiences. So, in contrast to this, as we said before, knowledge for Dewey is an action, is a form of doing, is an instrumental action. And central to this understanding of knowledge as an instrumental action is the idea of inquiry. Now, inquiry for Dewey is a process in which we investigate a problematic situation. We propose different hypotheses to solve this problematic situation, and then we test the possible solutions in order to arrive at a new, more stable way of interacting with the world and, of course, not with others. This implies that knowledge is the outcome of an experimental process that is both provisional and reliable. It is provisional because we can always revise our solutions in light of new evidences, in new information, but it's also reliable because it has been tested in experiences. The solution that we decide to take have been tested, and since they show themselves as practical, as being useful, we decided to take those solutions. So you see here that, again, knowledge is the outcome of this experimental process that is both provisional and reliable. Okay, now knowledge, as we said, is the outcome of a process of inquiry. If knowledge is the outcome of a process of inquiry, this means that thinking is the activity of inquiry itself. That is, thinking is a problem-solving process made up of several stages. According to Dewey, there are 5 fundamental stages. So thinking occurs within 5 stages. This kind of thinking is generally called by Dewey reflective thinking. But here I want to look at the 5 stages because they're really, really important. So the first stage is called facing a difficulty or encountering a problem. Thinking, according to John Dewey, begins when our normal routines are interrupted and disrupted by a doubt, a situation in which we face a doubt, an uncertainty, a confusion, a difficulty, and so on and so forth. That is, we think because there is a situation that imposes to us to think. These situations are generally called by Dewey indeterminate situations. So it is when we face an indeterminate situation that we start to think, because this indeterminate situation prevents us from carrying on as usual, that is, to continue to have the same habits, in as much as it creates a conflict between what is and what we desire. Dewey underlines how without such distortions, there would be no need to think. So these distortions are actually fundamental, and we should be on the lookout for these situations in which we feel an emotional disturbance and we perceive this sort of like feeling of something being strange and something being puzzling. We should not avoid this kind of situations, but we should be on the lookout for these situations because they're actually an opportunity for a deeper kind of reflection. Here, I want to quote what Dewey says about this kind of situations because I think it's really important. So, let me read. Every vital activity of any depth and range inevitably meets obstacles. The difficulties that present themselves within the development of an experience are to be cherished, not minimized, for they are the natural stimuli to reflective inquiry. So be on the lookout for this situation of uncertainty, of difficulty. Don't just throw them away or ignore them because they're actually important. They trigger the process of thinking. Okay, that's the first phase or stage. The second stage is called defining the difficulty or the problem. In the second stage, we clarify what exactly needs to be resolved. That is, in the second stage, we're able to define the problem that we are facing. And we can define the problem because instead of focusing on the vague feeling of difficulty, we focus on the conditions of the situation of uncertainty and difficulty. As Dewey defines it, this stage consists in the growing of meaning out of vagueness. And it is because, it defines it in this way because in this stage we are able to transform a raw confusion, an initial confusion, into a question that can be answered, that can find an answer. Now, in order to allow this transformation to happen, Dewey says we need three things. First, we need deliberate observation in order to bring to light what is the trouble and to make clear the character of the trouble or the problem itself. We don't need simply noticing the problem. We need something more. We need an attentive observation, an active observation. And you remember that we talked about it in the first class. That's the first thing that we need in order to transform that raw confusion into a question that can find an answer. But we also need the postponement of judgment. We need to look at this vague confusion from every perspective. And so we cannot just rush to a conclusion. We need to sit and observe. Lastly, finally, what we need is to create multiple connections and to see the problem, the raw confusion, which is not yet a problem. We need to see this sort of like confusion from multiple perspectives. It is all only by following these three steps that we can transform this initial confusion into a problem that can find an answer. That's the second stage, and we can now move to the third stage, that is generating hypotheses. Now, once a problem has been identified and defined, the next step, of course, is to propose working hypotheses. That is, possible ways that could resolve the difficulty that we faced at the beginning. So for Dewey, an hypothesis is not just a random guess that pops into my mind, but it's actually an idea projected into the future. It is something that we might act upon if we had the chance. And so, in other words, an idea is this tool for navigating the inquiry, for orienting our own action so that we can resolve the problem or the difficulty that we faced at the beginning. Now, Dewey says that during the phase, it is good to come up with multiple hypotheses, even a rival hypothesis, and that's really, really fundamental, because otherwise we would have hypotheses that are too similar and they don't allow us to arrive at the best solution. This kind of step is very easy, I think, to understand. And so we can move to the fourth stage, which is that of reasoning about hypotheses and drawing consequences from this hypothesis. So once we have several hypotheses on the table, we have defined the problem, we have several hypotheses on the table, we can test this hypothesis by projecting what would happen if we apply this hypothesis to life. Okay, if we follow this hypothesis and all of their consequences in real life. You can see here that this stage involves logical thinking, because during this stage we start to weigh between pros and cons. We start to predict future obstacles, and we start to evaluate all of the options that we have, looking for the option that seems the most promising one. And so in this stage, there's a lot of reflection, there is a lot of thinking, because we have to judge and evaluate all of the possibilities that we have come up with. And therefore, this process takes time. Dewey tells us that we should not rush this stage, this fourth stage, because it's really important. As Dewey claims, and I read again, the working over a vague and more or less causal idea into a coherent and definite form is impossible without a pause, without freedom from distraction. We say stop and think. Well, all reflection involves at some point stopping external observations and reactions so that an idea might mature. So you see here that finding time to reflect about all of the consequences that follow from the hypothesis that we have picked, from the hypothesis that we have come up with, is really, really important. But Dewey also says that it is fundamental that we do not spend too much time reflecting and thinking about the hypothesis and the consequences of the hypothesis, because otherwise we aren't able to arrive at the last step. We sort of like paralyze ourselves. When we think too much, when we overthink, then the risk is to be paralyzed. And so prolong the reflection so long that we then are not able to actualize our ideas and our hypotheses in real life. So the idea of Dewey is to always follow the rule of proportionality, of a balance, an equilibrium between taking time, reflecting, and finding the opportunities to actualize what we thought. And so we come to the last stage, which is that of testing in action and corroborating the hypothesis. So we have come up with the hypothesis, we have drawn all of the consequences. Now it's time to pick one hypothesis and test it and to put it into practice. This stage is absolutely fundamental because it shows how thinking does not stop with reflection, with reasoning, but culminates in action, where ideas can be tested against reality. This stage, as I told you, and I'm going to repeat it, is fundamental, is crucial for Dewey's conception of reflective thought, because without this stage, thinking would stop being a form of doing, and it would only be a contemplative, a revised contemplative understanding. When we test an hypothesis, so when we pick an hypothesis and then test it, it can happen that this test succeed, and when it does, we're all done, we're okay, we can move on to another problem. But if the test does not succeed, this means that we have to go back to our hypothesis. We need to look closer and maybe be more precise in drawing all of the consequences that we need to draw. And we need to test the new hypothesis that we have picked anew. So you see here that if we're lucky, we only have to test one hypothesis. If we're not lucky, then we have to test multiple hypotheses. It depends how this like test within experience goes. Okay, so we looked at all of the steps that, according to Dewey, compose and made up the activity of reflective thinking. It should be pretty clear because I think he is very, very good and he explains really, really well all of the steps, analyzing and highlighting all of the details that compose each of the steps that make up reflective thinking. But I still want to make an example for you in order to have things completely clear, maybe. That's my hope, but maybe it's not. Okay, so the example is called a science classroom experiment, and let me read it to you. A group of high school students is growing bean plants in different conditions for a biology project. After 2 weeks, they notice that one plant placed by the window is wilting, while the others in similar spots are healthy. This creates a doubt within the students. Why is the plant not thriving? That's the sort of like the initial difficulty or doubt or uncertainty that the student have. They don't understand why it's happening that one plant is not growing, is not thriving as the other ones. And that's the first step or stage of reflective thinking. The second one, the students move from a vague confusion, the plant looks bad, to formulating a precise problem. What factor is causing this particular plant to wilt while the others are growing normally? That's the problem, and that's the question that the students come up with. That's the second stage. They move on from this question to the hypothesis that should answer this question. They brainstorm possible explanations. Maybe the plant is getting too much direct sunlight. Perhaps the soil is in that pot is lacking nutrients. It could be that they forgot to water the plant. Maybe pests or mold are affecting the roots of that particular plant. Now, reasoning through all of the questions, the consequences of this hypothesis, the students come up with these ideas. If the sunlight is the issue, then moving the plant slightly away from the window should help. If the soil is the problem, replacing the soil should show improvement, should allow the plant to improve. If lack of water is the cause of the plant's wilting, then watering consistently should restore growth. If pests and mold are present, they should find visible signs in the roots or in the leaves, they meaning the students. And so here, this is the fourth stage where they're analyzing the hypothesis that they made by drawing the consequences. Last, the stage of testing the hypothesis and the consequences that they draw from those hypotheses. The students check the soil and discover it is much drier than the other plants. They water the plant regularly for a week and they observe the results. The plant begins to recover. The test therefore confirms the initial hypothesis and the problem is finally resolved. So you see here that the students, they go on all of the passages of Dewey's stages of reflective thinking, and by going through all of the stages, they're able to solve the problem and they are able to save the little plant. Okay, now we can finally come to our conclusion and draw, as Dewey drew the consequences from the hypothesis, draw the implications between these understanding of the process of thinking and visual thinking. So, Dewey's approach to reflective thinking and learning is strongly oriented to action and to the re-evaluation of experience. As a way of summarizing everything that we have said, and that's a very brief summary, I must say, Dewey's idea of thinking as a form of doing has at least 4 fundamental doing. Thinking is a form of doing because it grows out of action. As we said, Dewey thinks that thinking always begins when an habitual situation is interrupted and disrupted. So thinking is continuous with doing because it represents a more refined phase of our practical interaction with the world. Second, thinking is a form of doing because ideas are tools and instruments for our actions. Concepts, hypotheses, theories, scientific laws, they're all instruments that we can use for navigating different situations. That is, for resolving a problem and a situation of difficulty and uncertainty. And so ideas help us to cope with the world, to interact with the world in a better way, in a more accurate and a more unique way. Third point, the third meaning of thinking is a form of doing is that thinking culminates in testing. That is, reflection will always be incomplete, according to Dewey, of course, until we put it to test, until we test it and put it into action. All our hypothesis needs to be validated by experience, needs to be validated by the external world. We cannot stop and we cannot actually imprison our idea in the abstract space of the mind. We need to try them out. We need to verify whether they are useful or not, whether they are accurate or not, whether they are valid or not. That's really, really fundamental. And lastly, thinking is a form of doing in as much as thinking transforms reality. Now, inquiry, that is the process of thinking, leads us to and creates new forms of doing, new ways of acting, and this allows us to change ourselves as well as change the world. So thinking transforms reality. Thinking is a process that allows us to change and also to change the environment that we inhabit. Now that we have a better understanding of Dewey's conception of knowledge and his interpretation of the process of thinking, we can connect it with visual thinking, and we can actually test how the two resonate with one another. Now, according to visual thinking, as we know, drawing is not limited to illustrated concepts that we already possess. It's not just simply the reproduction of a concept in visual terms. Visual thinking actually functions as a creative and cognitive process through which new knowledges are generated, constructed, and tested. When we sketch while we reason, what we do is not simply record certain ideas that were given to us by the teacher or by our boss or whatever person we might think of. What happens when we sketch while reasoning is that we transform into something tangible and visible. We transform what we know into a tangible and visible form that we can observe, that we can question, that we can test, and we can rework. In this sense, drawing is a kind of thinking laboratory because each line, each shape, each connection that we put on the paper is an externalization of our thought, of our ideas, of what happens in our mind. And thus, it allows us to make a step back and to evaluate everything that is happening in the mind. And so we can ask ourselves when we do the drawing, does this diagram really capture the problem that we are dealing with? Are the relationships and the connections that I draw accurate or not? What happens if I rearrange the elements that I thought were fundamental to understand the problem that I was dealing with or I am dealing with? Now you can see here that this process of actualizing my ideas and my thought turns the act of drawing into a concrete form of experimentation with ideas and hypotheses. My ideas become concrete. They become maps and sketches that they have a materiality, they have a consistency, and so they are the actualization of my own ideas. So instead of keeping my ideas locked in the abstract space of the mind, as I already told you, visual thinking gives my idea a concrete presence, a presence that can be examined, modified, and improved. But you see here that by drawing ideas, this is the first actions, that is the first transformation of ideas into action before we transform them into a form of doing in the external world. Okay, that's the first thing to say. But there's another important thing to say, that when we consider visual thinking as a collective exercise, its power becomes even more evident. Its transformation of thinking into a form of doing becomes even more evident. When people indeed draw together in real time, so they're creating maps together in real time, whether it is during a meeting or a workshop or a collaborative session, they are co-constructing meaning while meaning unfolds itself. So the shared drawing surface becomes this space of navigation where individual ideas or perspectives converge, overlap, but also they might clash with one another, giving rise, certainly, that's for sure, to new insights that no single participant could have generated alone by themselves. In this context, we can see that connections between concepts or ideas are not imposed on the participants by an external authority, but they actually emerge organically through the discussions and the interactions of the people themselves. And so you can see here that by this interaction, participant can, of course, evaluate, test their own ideas, and then they can create a shared map, a collective shared map of understanding. By the end of a collective exercise, a collective visual, we can say, exercise, what remains on the page is not only the visual representation of an idea, but it's actually the trace of a collaborative journey of thought. It's the result of all of the question being asked, of all of the disagreement being explored, and all of the connection being discovered. Now, before I conclude for real this time, I just want to make one very short example to allow you to better exemplify how visual thinking helps us to understand that thinking is a form of doing. This exercise is called Construct Your Own Thinking. Now, it consists, and it begins actually when we have a question, when we have a problem. For instance, what is education today? What is justice today? What does it mean to be gentle and kind? And so on and so forth. All of this philosophical problems. So we begin with a philosophical problem or question, and each of the participants respond not with words, but actually with shapes, symbols, and spatial relationships. After they create this visual representation of the problem, the participants of the activity, they are paired in groups, in small groups. And what they need to do within the small groups is to combine their visual representations into larger maps and to discuss about elements that should be eliminated, elements that should be added, and so on and so forth. Now, all of the changes that are being made, namely what is being added, what is being highlighted as fundamental, what is being transformed, they reveal how interaction with one another modifies our thought. Indeed, the exercise shows us how learning is not the accumulation of knowledge. So the exercise shows us concretely, in concrete terms, how knowledge is not about accumulating information, but it's about reconstructing meaning through the interaction with others and with the environment that surrounds us. This is really, really important. I would suggest to you to try this exercise whenever you want, because what you find out through this exercise is so brilliant, is so deep that it shocks you. I have explained to you what it means that thinking is a form of doing, but if you try in real life to experiment with thinking as a form of doing, you're gonna be transformed, truly and intrinsically transformed. So this is the conclusion of our class. I want to thank you for your attention and your time, and we're gonna see each other very soon for the explanation of this week's exercise and the last class on discovery. Thank you.